a nice little we hope you had a nice little break, as we'll now be switching gears and diving into the Conservancy's grant basics training of the day. And my name is Vanessa Akson, and today Sarah Haugen, Shalini Kannan, and myself will be leading this training on Explore the Coast grants. Next slide, please. Please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions that come up. We'll try to answer it in the moment, but we will also have a Q&A after this training. And for returning grantees, you can also share your experience and any tips or tricks on how you manage your ETC grant. Next slide, please. So you got your SCC grant. Now what? In this slide, we have outlined the steps and workflow of the ETC grant. So it starts with your grant agreement, going to your conditions precedent, the work program, to starting the work, progress reports and invoicing, and then the completion of your project. We will explore these steps and also highlighting the key components for each of these parts. Next slide, please. So first, we have the grant agreement, and that outlines the terms and conditions of your grant. So it is a contract and it is legally binding document. Any formal changes would need a grant agreement, or I'm sorry, a grant amendment. And that is something that your project manager would need to determine if a grant amendment is necessary. There are 3 important dates to look at, which is your work completion date. And that is the date that all your work needs to be completed. So in other words, that is the last day you can bill to your ETC grant. Any work done after, it cannot be paid for. Second is the final request for disbursement submittal date. And that is the last day to submit your request for disbursement. And typically it is 1 month after the work completion date. The third is grant termination date. And that is the day your grant legally expires. And that is 3 months after the final request for disbursement date. Your grant agreement comes with a grant agreement number that will be used on invoicing and other future documents. Next slide, please. So there are a set of documents that need to be submitted and approved by your Conservancy project manager, and they are called conditions precedent to disbursement. The first is the board resolution, and it is a formal resolution from your governing board that authorizes your organization to enter into an agreement with the Conservancy to accept the grant funds. It is also where your board authorizes a designated person or persons to follow the Conservancy's grant requirements and to execute the project. The second is work program, and Sarah will go over it in detail, but a brief overview, it is like a roadmap. It details the work that you will complete under the grant, and there are 3 main components. It is the budget, subcontractors, and plan for acknowledgement. And lastly, there's the proof of insurance policy and any permits if necessary. But most of our ETC projects are coastal recreation projects, so permits are not typically needed. The image on the right here highlights, well, in the red box on the bottom, shows that the certificate holder is the Coastal Conservancy. We do have examples of these documents, so please ask your project manager if you're interested in taking a look. Next slide, please. So finally, once your grant agreement has been signed and all your conditions precedent have been met, you will receive a approval letter or an email that would be sent by your project manager. So that is your notice to proceed letter. And that is when you may begin work under your ETC grant. I'm going to pass this off to Sarah, who will go over the work program.
Thanks, Vanessa. So as Vanessa mentioned, the work program is part of the conditions precedent, but it's also a very useful document over the course of your grant with the Conservancy. Its purposes are to guide your project toward completion in concert with your grant agreement. And also it establishes your project's budget and schedule. So I've included a screenshot here of the template. And this year we've updated our work program template just for Explore the Coast grantees to be annotated with some more information and just guidance on how to fill it out. So hopefully it's a bit easier, but you're always welcome to work with your project manager on that. And another reason for the work program is that the grant agreement can only be changed through a formal amendment process. And so you can think of your work program as a flexible document that can be revised along with your project manager. And we'll have these templates available soon. You'll get them sent to you. Next slide. So the first part of your work program is the project description. And this is just a concise high-level summary of your project, just wanting to see the goal of your project and what you'll do to achieve them. So in this example, you'll see the first sentence. This is from Brown Girl Surf. They've said their goal is to connect women and girls to the ocean. And then in the next part, they explain how they'll do it, how many people will go, what kind of days they'll have, that kind of thing. So pretty short, but gets right to the point. So next slide. Next is the scope of work. And in this section, you'll describe your project in task form. So for each task, you'll provide a short narrative description containing different details for the task, such as what participants will do, where they'll do it, and when. And this can be done by activity or by expense type. So it could be, is it a day of camping or overnight activity versus a day trips, or it could be by expense type, such as travel and food. So it just depends what makes the most sense for you. And along with each task, you'll include the outcome, which is what we call deliverables are part of each task. And for us, those are like a documented version of what happened. So if, let's say, you're training 5 camp instructors, a deliverable for that would be a camp instructor roster. And so just making sure I cover everything here. Yeah, so just work with your project manager to figure out the best way to do this. And as we noted, you'll want to be just specific enough to know what's happening, but not too specific where you'll be, if things change, you'll have to update your work program all the time. So just try to strike that balance with your project manager. Next slide. Next is the schedule. And this describes your tasks in table format and with the dates of how it's happening. So you'll carry over the same task title and deliverables. And then this is where you'll tell us when you expect to start each task and complete it, along with when you'll turn in the deliverables for those tasks. Next slide. So the budget. This is one of the most important parts of your work program because it contains, again, your task numbers and titles as you describe them in your scope and schedule, and also, of course, the amounts of funding you'll use for each task. It's important to be simple here as well because our contracts department that reviews invoices needs to be able to easily read your budget to track it against your invoices. And so you can see a couple examples here. One has it by expense type and one by activity. And so that's the same way you can format your tasks and schedule, just depends what makes the most sense. So on the first example, you can see they have project management as a task. They've also broken things down into planning for their camps and transport, as well as project evaluation, while the second example is more by type of activity and less about materials or expense type. Please note that if you'd like, you can also, if you have a fiscal sponsor, to also include that as a line item as part of your budget. Okay, next slide. Another part of the budget is the budget narrative or details where you explain the direct costs, travel costs, and indirect costs of your budget. And I'll go over the difference between direct and indirect in a moment. But just please note that we do want to see a description of these different items so we can understand what you're billing. In the example, you'll see there's materials and equipment. They've included wetsuits, surfboards, that kind of thing. They have travel costs as billing against the state mileage rate. They've included labor, which is their staff carrying out the programming, indirect costs, and their subcontractor is a sailing company who's carrying out their sailing days. Also note that any organization receiving funding from the Conservancy must meet strict accounting standards. And there's always a possibility of an audit of your grant. So it's very important that you're following generally accepted accounting principles and to work with your accountant to make sure you're following these. Next slide. So direct costs are those expenses related to carrying out your project work. So directly related to what you're doing. That can include labor for project management and implementation. It can include materials such as the kayak, the materials I listed in the last slide. Also subcontractors, food and transport. Some examples here, they have tents and surfboards. Do check with your project manager about certain materials like that are larger expenses. And also your fiscal sponsorship fee is considered a direct cost. And do describe any travel costs such as bus or car rentals in this section. Shalini will go into greater detail about those when she's sharing about the invoicing. But that's direct costs. And again, we do have budget guidelines you can review if you're unsure before reaching out to your project manager. And as part of that, we have a new resource that we'll also be sending out to grantees, our allowable costs chart. We know it's kind of confusing. As a state agency, there's only we can only spend our funds, on reasonable and necessary costs for our grants. And that can seem kind of like a gray area sometimes. So we have done our best to lay out what kinds of materials we definitely can purchase through the grant, those that are kind of, it depends what the use will be, and others that we simply can't pay for. And some examples of that are gift cards, gas cards, prizes, or purchasing a vehicle. Those are just things that state funding cannot cover. And again, you can always talk to your project manager if you're unsure, and we'll be sending out this guidance document soon. Next, indirect costs. These are projects, these are costs not specific to your project. And that they're the costs of doing business. So it's also known as overhead and can include things such as rent, utility bills, general purpose equipment like computers. And you're allowed to bill up to 20% of your grant to these sorts of costs, these costs of business. But again, you should work with your accountant to determine the rate that's appropriate for your organization, because you're expected to keep detailed records of the expenses should you be audited. Next, subcontractors. As we talked about earlier with the tribal organization as a partner, any entity you plan to pay as part of someone carrying out direct work in your project is considered a subcontractor under your grant. And so what you'll do in your work program is list out any subcontractors you plan to work with. And some examples could be kayaking instructors, wilderness safety instructors, or any other community partners that you'll be paying to do project work. You'll write out the name of the organization, their qualifications, and a brief scope of work of what they'll be covering. And if you realize after your work program is approved that you need to hire another subcontractor over the course of your grant, you can email your project manager with that same information, and that'll help you get approved to use those subcontractors before you hire them. And this is in place because if you just submit an invoice without an approved subcontractor, our team doesn't know if that's an approved cost. So that's why we have a little process for making sure they're approved. Finally, the plan for acknowledgement. This is a required part of the grant agreement, and so it's placed in your work program to add some more description. Simply, the Conservancy would like to be acknowledged in your announcements and communications when you mention your Explore the Coast program, because this helps us get recognition and ensure that more funding from the state comes each year for this grant program. So there's a few examples on the screen. It could just be social media, anything on your website, press releases, program brochures, whatever it is you're using to promote your programming. So that concludes my section, and I'll be passing it on to Shalini to talk about what to do when you start work on your grant.
Hi, everyone. So after you get your work program ready and all the other conditions precedent that Sarah and Vanessa discussed, your project manager sends you that start work or notice to proceed email, and you go ahead and start on your project. We're not going to go into that because you all are the experts on that. But what we will go into is how you get paid. So next slide, please. So typically our conservancy grants are paid on a reimbursement basis. So that means you pay the costs and then you submit invoices to us and we repay you, reimburse you. We do acknowledge that this can be hard for some organizations. So there is another option, the advanced payment program, which Vanessa will go over later. But for the typical grantee, grants are on a reimbursement basis. You're required to submit invoices while your project is going every quarter at a minimum or monthly at a maximum. And your invoices will consist of a few things: the request for disbursement form, a progress report, and backup documentation of your costs. I'll go into all of these more, so don't worry if you're confused already. You'll then combine all of these documents into a single PDF and email them to invoices@scc.ca.gov, and you'll CC your project manager. In the past, we've required mailing hard copies because we're the government and we're old school, but we're making small steps and you don't have to mail in any paper copies anymore. Next slide. The progress report, I'll go over first. And we have a template for this that you'll be provided. And you use the template for the progress report to provide an update on your project. You'll talk about your project progress, any challenges and successes in the billing period. For final reports, which are the last report of your term, there's a separate template that will also provide you. In the progress report, there's a few optional sections as well, including pictures, stories, and survey results. We don't require these, but we do appreciate them if you have them. Next slide. Here is a screenshot of the progress report template. So basically, you'll put in the information about your grant in that table, and then in the first section, you'll provide a brief update on your project and how things are going. Please feel free to be brief, but clear and informative. We want to hear what went on, but we don't need lengthy narratives that you take a long time to write. If you're already writing those for another purpose, you can definitely include them, but don't feel like you have to impress us with beautiful language. We really just want to know how your project is going. You can even use bullet points if you want to. We want this to be as efficient but informative as possible. In part 2, you write about the community participants that you served. In the progress reports, just like a brief update is fine. Like if you see this example, our program served 40 participants, about 80% were BIPOC, all participants were from Title I schools, and they joined from Richmond, Oakland, San Francisco, and Hayward. Something like that is fine, but just know that for the final report, we'll need some breakdown of your participant data. So please keep track of your participants throughout the term of the project. Part 3 is grant acknowledgement, and you can check the box if you've acknowledged conservancy funding in this term. And then the last part is the optional things we talked about: photos and impact stories. These we like to see because sometimes we share them with our board to get funding for this kind of work, or with others in Sacramento. And then the survey results. Not all projects do surveys, but if you do, we love to see a summary of it because, again, it just shows how impactful your project is. If you're not doing surveys, you don't have to do them for us. Next slide. Next up is the request for disbursement form. So here's a screenshot of it. There's a front page and a back page, and you can download these as an Excel format or a PDF format from our website, or your project manager can send them to you. And the form self-calculates, so you'll enter in the first fields, but some will calculate for you. Next slide. So the first page On this page, you put in information about your organization and project at the top. And then this side of the form summarizes your expenses from the billing period by task. So as Sarah talked about in the work program, you outline your project by task, and each task has a budget. So in those first two columns, you should match what's in your work program and write the task's number, name, and budget. So this is just exactly what is written in your work program. And then in the next column, costs incurred this period, that's where you write down how much was spent on each task during the billing period. And then in the column with the green box around it, that's the total cost to date column. So in that, you sum the costs incurred this period with the costs from all your past invoices combined. So that way, the remaining balance column can self-calculate and show how much money you have remaining under each task. At the bottom of this form, you'll see the section about a withholding of 5%. This is a standard term that the Conservancy has on all of our grants. It's a policy and a state policy that we withhold a portion of the grant until all the deliverables are completed at the end of the grant. And at that time, we'll return this last 5%. So what this means is if you submit an invoice for $100, then we approve the invoice, but we only pay you $95 until you completely finish the project, at which time we'll provide that last $5. So if you're submitting your final invoice, then you check this box that says final invoice, and at that time we'll release that final 5%. Next slide. This is page 2 of the request for disbursement form. And this side breaks down the expenses that are rolled up on page 1. And it's listed by expense on this side. And there's different categories on the form: materials and equipment, labor, indirect cost, and subcontractor expenditures. And for all of these expenses, you'll have to submit backup documentation, except for labor, which we expect that you have records of in case of an audit, but we don't need to see because instead there's a column for hourly rate. I'll go over more about backup documentation in a minute. And in section C on indirect costs, the percentage you insert here must match what is written and approved in your work program. And you'll note that there's a column here, receipt/invoice number. So all the backup documentation, you can give it a number or use a number that's already on it. And this will allow us to match each expense with the corresponding receipt that's provided as backup. Next slide. Now I'll go into all that backup documentation. So for materials and equipment, you can provide paid or zero balance receipts. If you buy something online, we need to see that the receipt says the item was shipped, because that means that payment was completely made, not that it's just requesting your payment like an invoice or something. So this example of an Amazon receipt on the bottom shows shipped. That's something we'll look for. And then if you buy something in store, like this Costco receipt, just having the actual receipt is very important. Sometimes grantees might lose their receipts and want to provide us bank statements instead, but unfortunately, we can't honor those. So if you want to be reimbursed, you need to save your receipts. We recommend keeping a folder virtually or paper envelope where you save all your receipts in one place so that you're not scrambling to find them when it's time to invoice. Next. For travel costs, there's a few ways we can reimburse you. If people are using personal vehicles, there's two ways we can reimburse you. One way is using the personal vehicle mileage reimbursement rate. This is a state set rate each year. And right now, through December 2023, the rate is 0.655 cents. So if you want to go this route, you'll provide us a travel record, and an example is at the bottom of this slide, where you'll have the date, your start and your end point, and number of miles, and the amount, which is that mileage rate times the number of miles. And the other way we can reimburse you, if you don't want to use the mileage reimbursement rate, instead we can reimburse gas receipts. And in that case, again, you have to save the receipt. We can't use your bank statement or anything. And if you use rental cars or gig cars, for example, we can reimburse those costs as well with proof of the receipt. So for example, on the right here is a gig car receipt that we could reimburse. Next slide. More on travel costs. We can also pay bus rental or transportation like charter buses, anything like that, in which case you can provide the invoice of that transportation as your backup documentation. And we can also pay for parking fees and tolls, but you need to keep the receipts. That is a common theme. So that bottom is a parking receipt that we could reimburse. Next slide. So Sarah went into subcontractors a bit, but as a reminder, these are people or organizations that you're paying to complete a service for you that are not your employees. So maybe partner organizations or your consultants. So you provide their invoices as backup documentation to pay their costs. Some examples are specialized tour operators, partner organizations who take your participants on a day trip, or project-related accounting or technical assistance. So an example invoices here. Next slide. Now I'll pass it over to Vanessa to talk about the advanced payment program.
Thanks, Shalini. So as Shalini had mentioned earlier, that there is an alternative option to our reimbursement model, as over time we've heard of the many challenges that many of our ETC grantees would face with reimbursement. And so for this program, you would need to request to participate. And so if you're interested in this program, please reach out to your project manager so you can discuss further in detail. And after you've already discussed with your project manager, you would send an email requesting to participate, and it would go to your project manager, stating why your organization needs advanced funding. And you would also include some project information, such as your organization name, your project name, your grant agreement number, and if we don't have it already, a current MPO award questionnaire, an example of a staff timesheet if the advanced payment would be paying for employee time. This information can also be found in your executed grant agreement. Your PM will be the one to let you know if you are approved. So if you are approved for the advanced payment, you would submit an RFP to request for the advanced funds, and it may take about 4 to 6 weeks to receive it. And per advance, the maximum that you could request is $10,000 or 50% of the total grant, whichever is less there. You would need to complete a documentation of advanced funds. And so that is somewhat similar to the RFD form, as you would also document all your expenses, and you must include all your receipts, your invoices, and a progress report. This DAF form must be submitted at least quarterly. Next slide, please. So for project completion, this is the point where you're ready to close out your project as you are nearing the end of it. You would want to talk to your project manager that you are ready to do so, and they will ensure that your project deliverables have been submitted. And once you receive the go-ahead, you'll be asked to complete a final report and submit any final billings and request disbursement of your withholding. And that would conclude your ETC project. Next slide, please. We do have resources, and that is our grantee manual. So that explains a lot of the processes that we went over today, and also includes links to conditions precedent documents. Another great resource is your project manager. They're there to support you and also answer any questions that you may have about your grant. And also please talk to your project manager if there are any changes or updates to your project. And we also have our new documents, which are the allowable costs and the updated ETC work program, which you'll be receiving soon. Next slide, please. And that is the end of our training. And we do have some time, I believe, for some Q&A.
I think we only have 3 minutes, but if we don't get to any questions, we could meet after the meeting too.
Thanks, Shalini.
Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. And thanks, Bryce. Bryce put the grantee manual and ETC work program template and allowable cost document in the chat. Feel free to save these or we'll send them to you again. Where can we find the ETC progress report template? This is included as an exhibit to your grant agreement, but you can also ask your project manager and they'll send it to you.
Kate asked, is there a timeline that notes when the first documents, including the work plan, is due? You work this out with your project manager based on when you're trying to start work and finish your project by. So there's no set deadline for everyone, but generally it's as soon as you want to get your work going. You should probably get started on the documents a few months before, because the insurance can take a while. If you have to get a board resolution done, you have to schedule that with your board. So leave ample time before your start date to get that stuff completed.
Mario, project managers have already been assigned.
If you're not sure who your project manager is, you can email explorethecoast@scc.ca.gov.
And then Daisy asked, can projects in the same region work together to host trips together for diverse groups of youth? And if so, how do we ensure to avoid duplication of efforts?
So in terms of like what the Conservancy is paying for, we can't pay for 2 organizations to lead the same day. I think if there's discrete separate portions of work, like this organization is leading the kayaking part, the other organization is leading the rest, then that could be okay. But if you see this as an issue for your project, it's definitely case by case and you should talk to your project manager. Any gray areas, talk to your project manager. Did that answer the question about duplication of efforts?
Hopefully.
I see Erin's gonna reach out to the project.
Awesome. We're going to wrap up and move on to our more general Q&A. Thank you to Sarah, Shalini, and Vanessa for the onboarding training, and to you all for attending today. We have a post-event survey that we would love for you all to fill out so we can have some feedback and suggestions for future events. And one of the questions is whether you are comfortable